Hey guys, tonight we begin in the dark. Not the comfortable dark of your bedroom with the soft glow of your phone screen. Not the city dark where streetlights bleed orange through the curtains. I mean real dark. The kind of dark that has weight to it. The kind of dark that, for most of human history, meant something was about to be demanded of you. What if I told you that for most of human history, the moment the sun touched the horizon, a woman's hardest work was only just beginning, and that not a single hour of it was ever counted, recorded, or paid? And what if I told you that the woman we're going to follow tonight, an ordinary farmer's wife in rural Massachusetts in 1743, worked harder between sunset and midnight than most modern adults work in an entire day, and that she did this every single night for her entire life, without a single day off? That's what tonight is about. One woman, one night, and 300 years of forgetting. I'd genuinely love it if you could hit that subscribe button, but only if tonight's journey truly moves you. No pressure. If this story stays with you, that's enough for me. And before we dive in, I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you right now? What city? What time is it there? Are you tucked in bed with the lights low, maybe one lamp burning softly across the room? Or are you winding down after a long shift, still in your work clothes, just needing something quiet to carry you into sleep? Maybe it's 2 a.m. and you can't explain why you're still awake, you just are. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that. Your stories, your cities, your 3M confessions, they genuinely make my night. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe put on some soft background noise, and let's step together into a farmhouse in colonial New England on an October evening in 1743. Picture this. You are standing at the edge of a dirt road in rural Massachusetts, and the sky above you is doing something extraordinary. It's that particular shade of deep amber that only happens in autumn, when the air is cold enough to make colours sharper, and the last wedge of sunlight is pressing itself flat against the tree line, like it's trying to hold on just a little longer. The maples have gone red and orange, and a colour that has no name. The smell of wood smoke is everywhere, not the nostalgic campfire kind, but the constant, dense, lived-in smoke of a house that has never once gone cold. Beneath it is something else. Wet leaves, cold mud, the faint sourness of the cow that needs to come in. A bread smell, faint and yeasty, drifting from somewhere inside the walls of a low, dark farmhouse about 30 yards ahead of you. Her name is Sarah. She is 26 years old. She has been awake since before sunrise. She has already done more physical work today than you will do this week, and the night has not yet begun. She is standing in the doorway of that farmhouse, a 1.5-story timber frame structure, low-ceilinged, with small windows designed not for the view, but to keep the cold out, and she is watching the sun go down, with an expression that has nothing romantic in it, no wistfulness, no poetry. What's on her face is closer to a runner watching a timer count down, because that's exactly what this is. The light is almost gone, and she is not finished. Here's something that will completely reframe how you think about the 18th century. There was no such thing as the end of the day for a woman like Sarah. The concept didn't exist. What existed instead was a continuous rolling set of obligations that simply changed their character when the sun went down. Daytime work required light and movement, tending the garden, hauling water, managing the livestock, cooking over the fire. Nighttime work required a different kind of endurance. Stillness, patience, the ability to function in near total darkness by the light of a single flame for hours. And the transition between the two happened in minutes. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian at Harvard University, whose landmark work on colonial New England women essentially created the field of early American women's history, writes that the lives of women like Sarah were structured not by clocks but by light. The sun was the only schedule that mattered, and when it set, the schedule didn't end, it transformed. What strikes me most, every time I sit with this, is how completely this inverts our modern intuition. We think of sunset as a release, a permission. The workday is over, the evening is yours, a mission. For Sarah, sunset was the opposite. It was a signal, a starting gun for a different category of labour that would carry her through to midnight or beyond, every single night of her life. The farmhouse behind her is small by any standard. One main room, the keeping room where the family eats, works, sleeps near the fire, a sleeping loft above. A lean-to kitchen attached at the back. The windows are tiny, the ceilings are low, and every architectural choice has been made with a single priority in mind: retain heat. In a Massachusetts winter, the cold doesn't ask permission. It comes through the walls, through the floor, through the gaps around the door frame. The fire in the keeping room is not decorative. It is survival infrastructure. And tonight, like every night, it is Sarah's job to make sure it doesn't go out. She takes one last look at the sky. The amber is going grey now, the grey going purple, the purple going the deep, absolute blue that means night is here and there is no more time to stand in doorways. She turns back inside. The night begins. But here's the thing: before we can understand what happens inside that farmhouse over the next several hours, we need to understand something that Sarah understood in her bones. Something she had understood since she was old enough to be afraid. The night in 1743 was not safe. Not in the way we mean when we talk about safety today, with our locked doors and our phone signal and our neighbours 20 feet away. The dark that was about to swallow this farmhouse was something else entirely. And that's exactly where we're going next. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you were in truly complete darkness? Not dim. Not the grey dark of an overcast night in a city. I mean the kind of darkness where you hold your hand up in front of your face and you cannot see it. Where your eyes, no matter how long they adjust, find absolutely nothing to work with. Where the darkness is not an absence of light so much as a presence of something else, something thick and close and listening. Most of us living in the modern world have never actually experienced this. We are so thoroughly surrounded by light pollution, by standby indicators and phone screens and the distant orange haze of cities, that genuine darkness has become almost theoretical. We know it exists. We've just never really met it. Sarah met it every single night of her life. And here's what will absolutely blow your mind. The darkness she lived inside was not the only thing she was afraid of. In fact, the darkness was almost the least of it. Because inside that small timber frame farmhouse, there was something far more terrifying than the absence of light. Something that killed more colonial Americans than disease, more than warfare, more than the brutal winters that came howling off the Atlantic every year. Fire. Picture this. It is somewhere around 8 o'clock in the evening. The sun has been down for nearly 2 hours. Outside the farmhouse, the night is absolute no moon tonight. Clouds thick and low, the kind of darkness that makes the forest 30 yards away completely disappear. You are inside the keeping room. The fire in the hearth is the only light source in the entire building. It throws orange and amber across the low ceiling, across the rough-hewn beams, across the faces of the children, sitting close to it on the floor. The shadows it makes are enormous and restless, moving with every shift of the flame. The walls are timber, the floor is timber, the ceiling is timber, the furniture is timber. The curtains, the few there are linen, dried by months of proximity to the fire until they are essentially tinder. Everything in this room will burn, and in the centre of it all, there is an open flame that never goes out. This is the foundational terror of domestic life in colonial New England, and it is one that historians have only recently begun to take seriously as a psychological force in women's lives. Anne Little, a historian at Colorado State University who specializes in early American gender and survival, has written extensively about what she calls the architecture of anxiety that shaped women's daily experience, the constant, low-grade awareness that the home you were responsible for maintaining was also the home most likely to kill you. The statistics are staggering. Fire was the leading cause of accidental death in colonial America. In Boston alone, during the 1760s, major fires destroyed entire city blocks with terrifying regularity. But those were city fires, dramatic, documented, remembered. The farmhouse fires that consumed rural families in the night were quieter catastrophes. They happened in the dark, far from neighbours, far from any help. By the time anyone knew, it was already over. And who was awake when these fires started? Who was the last one to tend the hearth before the family went to sleep? Who got up in the night when a child cried, moving through the dark room with a candle? Sarah, always Sarah. But here's the kicker, fire wasn't the only thing living in the dark with her. Because once you remove the fire from the equation, once you imagine the hearth going cold and the single candle snuffed out, what you are left with is a quality of darkness that has a physical dimension to it. A weight. Historians and sleep researchers who study pre-industrial societies describe what they call first sleep and second sleep, the natural human pattern, before artificial light disrupted it, of sleeping in two distinct phases, with a wakeful period in between. During that wakeful middle period, people in the 17th and 18th centuries would lie in darkness so complete that many reported a kind of sensory heightening sounds became enormous. Imagination became uncontrollable. The distance between inside the house and outside the house felt dangerously thin. Roger Ekirk, a historian at Virginia Tech, who spent 20 years researching pre-industrial sleep patterns and published his findings in the landmark work Times, At Day's Close, Night in Times Past, documented hundreds of accounts from this era describing the psychological experience of nighttime wakefulness. What emerges from these accounts is consistent and striking. The night was not experienced as neutral. It was experienced as inhabited. Every creak of the timber frame was a structural warning or an intruder. Every sound from outside, and there were always sounds. The forest was never truly silent, arrived without context, without visual information, amplified by the absolute dark into something that demanded interpretation. And for a woman alone with sleeping children, interpretation meant one thing: assessment of threat. What strikes me most about this is that the fear wasn't irrational. It was entirely appropriate to the situation. Sarah wasn't jumping at shadows because she was weak or superstitious. She was running a continuous, exhausting threat assessment because the threats were real. A fire that caught in the thatch could consume the house in under 20 minutes. An unlocked door in a rural area with no law enforcement closer than several hours away was a genuine vulnerability. A child with a fever in the night who went unheard could be gone by morning. The darkness wasn't a metaphor for something. It was the actual condition under which real, serious dangers operated, and she navigated it alone, every night. Here's where it gets really interesting, and by interesting, I mean genuinely heartbreaking, when you look at the variation in how this darkness was experienced across class lines. Because Sarah, as a middling farmer's wife, had it better than most. She had a house. She had a hearth. She had, presumably, a husband who was at least sometimes present. She had enough to eat and enough fuel to keep the fire going through the night. Now consider the women who didn't. Indentured servants, who in 1743 Massachusetts might sleep in an unheated lean-to or a barn loft, with no fire of their own and no lock on their door. Enslaved women in the colonies and Massachusetts in 1743 still held enslaved people. This is not a Southern story alone who had no legal claim to the safety of any space, who could be moved, separated, violated at any moment regardless of what the darkness held. Women on the absolute frontier, in settlements so isolated that the nearest neighbour might be 3 miles through forest, who faced not just fire and darkness, but the genuine possibility of violence from multiple directions with no recourse whatsoever. The darkness landed differently depending on where you stood in the social order, but it landed on everyone. I find it remarkable, and I use that word carefully, because what I really mean is that I find it quietly devastating that this constant, embodied fear was simply considered part of a woman's domestic responsibility. It wasn't named, it wasn't acknowledged, it wasn't compensated, it was just the texture of a woman's night. So ordinary and so universal that no one thought to write it down as anything other than the natural order of things. Sarah checks the door bar before she sits down to work. She checks the window latches. She positions herself in the keeping room where she can see the fire and the door simultaneously. She keeps a candle within reach even when she's working by firelight, because if the fire does something unexpected, she needs to be able to move fast, and she needs to be able to see. These are not neurotic behaviours. They are the entirely rational protocols of a woman who has correctly assessed her environment and is managing it with the tools available to her. And even as she does all of this, even as she runs this quiet, constant background program of threat awareness, she is also doing something else entirely. Something that requires concentration and skill and patience. Something that the family's survival depends on just as much as the locked door and the tended fire. But before we get there, we need to talk about what's making the light she's working by. Because the single flame burning on the table beside her, it cost more than you think, in ways that go far beyond money. I want you to think about the last time you turned on a light. Not think about it really, just did it. Reached out, flipped the switch and the room filled with light. Didn't cost you a thought. Didn't cost you much of anything, really. Maybe a fraction of a cent on your electricity bill. Maybe nothing you'd ever notice. Now I want you to imagine that the light in your home, every hour of it, every single evening of the year had to be manufactured by hand, by you, from scratch, using rendered animal fat and cotton string in a process that takes days and fills your house with a smell that doesn't fully leave for weeks, and that if you didn't do it, your family sat in the dark. That is Sarah's reality. And once you understand what it actually cost her to produce the light she's working by right now, this single pale flame guttering on the table beside her, you will never look at a light switch the same way again. Let's talk about candles. In the 18th century, candles were not a product you bought, not if you were a farming family in rural Massachusetts. You made them, once a year, in the autumn, in a process that consumed multiple days and represented one of the most significant single labor investments a woman made in the entire calendar year. Everything about candle making was front-loaded. You did it all at once, in the fall, because that was when the raw material was available. That was when the animals were slaughtered. Picture this. It is late October, perhaps 3 weeks before the night we've been following Sarah through. The air is cold enough to see your breath, which matters more than you might think, because cold air is what you need for this process to work. Sarah is outside, or in the lean-to kitchen, standing over a large iron kettle. Inside that kettle is tallow rendered animal fat, primarily from the cattle and sheep that have just been slaughtered in the autumn harvest. The smell is extraordinary, not pleasant. A deep, animal, fatty smell that gets into your hair and your clothes and the walls of the room and stays there. It is the smell of survival, of winter preparation, of the months of light that will carry the family through until spring. She has been doing this for 2 days already. She will do it for at least 2 more. Jane Nylander, a historian and curator whose meticulous research into New England domestic life produced the essential work times Our Own Snug Fireside, documented in precise detail the labour arithmetic of colonial candle making. The numbers are, frankly, staggering. A typical New England farmhouse family required somewhere in the range of 300 candles to see them through a single year. 300. And producing those 300 candles, rendering the fat, preparing the wicks, executing the dipping or moulding process, cooling and storing the finished product required between 75 and 100 hours of labour. 75 to 100 hours for 1 year's worth of light. That is more than 2 full work weeks, by modern standards, dedicated entirely to manufacturing the ability to see after dark. And here's what really keeps me awake at night about this. Those 75 to 100 hours are almost certainly an undercount. They represent the active production time. They don't account for the sourcing of materials, the tending of the animals whose fat would be rendered, the growing and harvesting of flax if bayberry wax was being used, the procurement of wicking material. They don't account for the planning, the organisation, the timing judgment required to execute the whole process in the narrow autumn window when conditions were right. They don't account for the years of skill development required to do it well, because doing it badly had consequences. A poorly made candle, one with air bubbles in the tallow, or an improperly sized wick, or fat that hadn't been fully rendered burned unevenly. It guttered. It dripped. It went out unexpectedly, plunging the room into darkness at the worst possible moment. A wick that was too thick produced a flame that consumed the candle twice as fast, cutting your carefully calculated supply dramatically short before February. A wick too thin and the candle barely produced usable light at all, just a tiny, struggling flame that made reading impossible and detailed handwork impossible and left the family squinting through shadow all evening. Getting it right was a skill, and like all skills, it took years to develop. But here's the kicker. Even a perfectly made candle, by the standards available to a family like Sarah's, was a remarkably humble source of light. The standard tallow candle produced by a colonial farm wife burned at approximately 12 lumens. 12. For context, a single modern 60-watt incandescent bulb produces around 800 lumens. A typical well-lit modern room might have 3,000 to 5,000 lumens available. Sarah's single candle, her primary evening light source, her carefully manufactured, enormously labour-intensive flame, produced about 1.5% of what you get from one ordinary light bulb. Let that land for a moment. She is doing detailed handwork, spinning, sewing, mending by the equivalent of 1.5% of a light bulb every evening. for her entire adult life. And yet not all candles were created equal. This is where the class dimensions of 18th century light become almost painfully vivid, because the tallow candles Sarah makes are the economy tier of colonial illumination. They are functional, they are what most people used, but they have significant drawbacks beyond their dimness. Tallow animal fat is not a stable substance at room temperature. In summer, candles made from it could soften and bend and even melt if stored improperly. They dripped constantly as they burned, requiring a steady hand or a well-designed holder beneath them. And the smell, that same fatty animal smell from the rendering process, never entirely left the finished product. A room lit by multiple tallow candles had a distinct and not entirely pleasant quality to its air. Above tallow, there was bayberry wax. Bayberry shrubs grew along the New England coastline, and their small waxy berries, boiled and skimmed, produced a greenish wax that burned cleaner, smelled better, a faint, herbal scent that was genuinely pleasant and held its shape through the summer. But producing bayberry wax was even more labour-intensive than tallow candles. It took approximately 15 pounds of berries to produce a single pound of wax. 15 pounds of berries, hand-harvested from low coastal shrubs. Bayberry candles were a luxury, used sparingly, save for company or for special occasions. Higher still was beeswax. Beeswax candles burned brightest, dripped least, smelled best, and lasted longest. They were also expensive enough that most farming families owned perhaps a handful, kept for situations where impression management mattered, a visit from the minister, a formal gathering, a moment when you needed the room to look as good as it possibly could. Beeswax was aspirational lighting. And then, at the absolute apex of 18th century illumination, there was spermaceti oil from the head cavity of the sperm whale, refined into a brilliant white wax that produced a candle of extraordinary quality. Bright, clean, nearly dripless, with a light output that was genuinely impressive by the standards of the age. Spermaceti candles were used in lighthouses. They were used in the homes of the very wealthy. They were, for a farming family in rural Massachusetts, essentially theoretical, something you might have heard of, something you would never own. Sarah's candles are tallow. She uses them with the precision of someone managing a finite and irreplaceable resource, because that is exactly what they are. The household allocation for a typical colonial family was roughly 1 candle per evening for ordinary working nights. 1. A household considered genuinely well lit might burn 7 candles simultaneously, and this was noted in period documents almost with a sense of wonder, as if 7 candles in a room at once was a kind of extravagance bordering on the irresponsible. 1 candle. That is Sarah's evening budget. She knows, without doing any arithmetic she'd recognise as arithmetic, that her supply needs to last until next October's rendering. She knows approximately how many evenings that is. She knows that if something goes wrong, if the candles are stored badly and go soft, if she miscounted during production, if there's an illness that requires more nighttime light than usual, there is no running to the store, there is no backup, there is only darkness. So she is careful, extraordinarily careful. The candle is positioned where it will do the most work for the most people. When it's not needed for detailed work, she works by firelight instead, saving the candle for tasks that genuinely require its directed beam. She trims the wick regularly. A long, charred wick produces a larger, mushrooming flame that consumes the candle faster, without producing proportionally more light. She watches the drips and catches them, because drip tallow can be remelted and reused. Nothing is wasted. Nothing. And through all of this management, all of this careful husbandry of her year's worth of light, there is always the other thing running in the background. The thing we talked about in the last chapter. The fire awareness. Because candles fall over, candle holders tip, wax drips onto surfaces that are made of wood, and wood, as Sarah knows as well as she knows anything, burns. There's a particular quality to the way Sarah handles the candle that period accounts, and later oral histories describe consistently a kind of unconscious but total attention to its position, its stability, its proximity to anything combustible. She never puts it near the curtains. She never leaves it unattended on an unstable surface. When she moves across the room, she cups her hand around the flame not to warm her hand, but to control the airflow around it, to prevent the draft from sending hot wax or a spark somewhere she doesn't want it to go. This is second nature to her. She doesn't think about it. It is simply part of how a person moves through a room at night in 1743. Here's what I find remarkable about all of this, and I want you to sit with this for a moment before we move on. Every hour of light in Sarah's evening, every moment of visibility that allows her to do her work, to read if she has the chance, to see her children's faces, to navigate her own home safely. Every single one of those illuminated hours was purchased in advance, with her own hands, at a cost of labour that was never recorded, never compensated, never acknowledged as the staggering act of provision that it was. She made the light. She made it, and she managed it, and she rationed it, and she guarded it, and she replaced it every year when it ran out, and nobody wrote it down. But now we have to ask, what was she doing under that light? Because the candle was not an end in itself, it was a tool. And the work she was doing by its light, every evening, for hours, was the work that kept her family clothed, that kept them warm. That was, in its own way, just as essential to survival as the fire and the food and the locked door. And what happened to that work during the Revolutionary War? That's where this story goes somewhere completely unexpected. Now that you understand what light actually cost her, the months of planning, the days of rendering, the 100 hours of labour, the single, carefully rationed candle burning on her table, I want you to go back with me, back to before the candle was lit, back to that last hour of daylight. Because here's what I didn't tell you at the beginning. When we watched Sarah standing in the doorway looking at the amber sky, with that expression that had nothing romantic in it, I told you she looked like a runner watching a timer countdown. What I didn't tell you was exactly what she was running from, and exactly what she was running toward. Now you know what she was running from. Darkness. Real darkness, with all its weight and fear and danger. And you know what running toward the light meant: not poetry, not metaphor, but 100 hours of labour, 300 candles, 12 lumens of carefully manufactured visibility. Number of K. So now let's watch her run. Picture this. It is approximately 4:30 in the afternoon on that October day in 1743. The sun is still technically above the horizon, but it is moving with the particular urgency of autumn sun, dropping faster than it seems like it should, the light going golden, and then amber, and then the flat, directionless grey. That means you have maybe 20 minutes before it's genuinely gone. Sarah knows this the way you know your own heartbeat, not by looking at it, not by calculating it, but by a lifelong attunement to the rhythms of a world governed entirely by natural light. She does not have 20 minutes to waste. What strikes me most, every time I read the primary sources from this period, is the sheer physical volume of what needed to happen in that final window of daylight. We're not talking about tidying up, Tiber. We're not talking about wrapping up loose ends. We're talking about a compressed sequence of tasks, each one genuinely urgent, each one with real consequences if skipped, that had to be executed in the right order before the light was gone. Thomas Jefferson, who, whatever his profound moral failures, he was a meticulous observer of agricultural labour, recorded in his farm journals that the productivity of spinning women varied by as much as 50% between summer and winter. 50%. The same woman, the same skill level, the same equipment producing half as much in December as she did in June. The difference was daylight hours. Every hour of natural light that disappeared from the working day was an hour of production that could never be fully recovered, no matter how many candles you burned. That 50% gap is the number that lives in Sarah's body every afternoon in October. She can feel winter coming, not in the temperature though, that too, but in the shrinking of her productive day. Every week the usable light gets shorter. Every week the gap between what needs to be done and what the daylight allows gets a little wider, and every week the pressure in that final golden hour gets a little more intense. So what does she actually do? Let's walk through it. The animals come first, always, because animals on a colonial farm were not pets, and they were not simply food sources, they were capital. A cow represented years of investment and provided milk, butter, and eventually meat. Chickens provided eggs. Sheep provided wool, and wool, as we're going to talk about very shortly, was quite literally what stood between the family and the cold. Losing an animal to a predator, and the predators in rural Massachusetts in 1743, were not metaphorical. Wolves still ranged through the forest, and foxes were a constant threat to poultry, was a financial and practical catastrophe that could take years to recover from. So before the light goes, the chickens are called in and penned, the cow is brought from the pasture and secured in the small barn, any other livestock is accounted for. Sarah does a head count the same way you might check that all the children are in bed systematically, without skipping, because the one you skip is always the one that's missing. Then the firewood. This one has a logic that isn't immediately obvious. You might think, why bring in firewood before dark? Why not do it in the morning? And the answer is partly that mornings have their own crisis schedule that we'll get to later. But mostly it's simpler than that. You cannot safely carry an armload of firewood across an uneven yard in the dark. Not without dropping it, not without tripping, not without, in the worst case, falling with a load of heavy wood and injuring yourself in a way that, in 1743, without accessible medical care, could sideline you for weeks. In a household economy where Sarah's labour is not optional, where there is no backup, no hired help, no calling in sick, an injury is a catastrophe. So the wood comes in while she can see where she's putting her feet. She carries it in multiple loads. Enough for the evening, enough for the night, enough to start the morning fire without having to go outside before dawn. Each load is stacked near the hearth with a specificity that looks casual, but isn't the larger pieces that will burn slow and long at the bottom, the smaller kindling accessible on top for when the fire needs to be encouraged back to life. Then, the water. Water in a colonial farmhouse came from a well or a stream, neither of which was inside the house. Hauling water meant going outside, which meant exposure to the dark, which meant doing it before the light was gone. Evening water meant filling the large iron pot that hung over the fire. This would heat overnight and be ready for morning washing and cooking, and filling the smaller vessel that sat on the kitchen shelf for immediate use. It also meant checking the water supply against the morning's anticipated needs and making a judgment call. Is there enough? Or does another trip need to happen now, while she can still see the path to the well? These are not small decisions. Each one requires an accurate mental model of the next 12 to 16 hours, a running calculation of what will be needed and when. Sarah is doing this continuously, automatically, the way a modern person might manage a complex calendar, except her calendar is written in muscle memory and necessity, not in an app. And then, and this is the one that historians keep coming back to, because it is both the most technically interesting and the most consequential, the fire. Not just tending the fire, banking it. To bank a fire. The phrase comes from the image of building up earthen banks around something to contain and preserve. It meant to prepare the hearth fire in a specific way that would allow it to survive the night without going out, while also not burning so hot and fast that it consumed all the available fuel before morning. It was a precise technical skill, and getting it wrong had significant consequences. Here's what I find absolutely fascinating about this. Fire, in a colonial household, was not a renewable resource in the way it might seem. You might think, well, if the fire goes out, you just relight it. Matches. Simple. But matches, as we know them, did not exist in 1743. Friction matches weren't invented until the 1820s. What existed instead were flint and steel, a method of producing a spark by striking flint against steel, catching that spark in a prepared tinder, usually charred cloth or dried fungus, and then carefully nurturing that tiny ember into a flame. On a good morning, this process took 10 to 15 minutes. On a bad morning, damp tinder, cold fingers, wind in the wrong direction, it could take much longer. Much, much longer. And in the meantime, no heat, no cooking, no light, children waking up cold, so you did not let the fire go out if you could possibly help it. David Freeman Hawke, whose meticulous scholarship on everyday life in colonial America painted an almost anthropological portrait of how ordinary people actually lived, documented the degree to which the management of the domestic fire represented a continuous, year-round technical responsibility, one that fell almost exclusively to women. The fire was tended first thing in the morning and last thing at night. It was banked before sleep and built back up before dawn. In between, it was monitored, managed and adjusted throughout the day in response to cooking requirements, temperature changes and available fuel. Banking it for the night meant building up a specific configuration. Larger logs arranged to burn slowly at the outer edges, the hottest coals pushed to the centre and covered with a deep layer of ash. The ash was the key. It acted as insulation, slowing the oxygen supply to the coals, reducing the rate of combustion to a slow, sustainable smoulder. Done correctly, the fire would still have live coals in the morning invisible under the ash, but there, Waiting and rebuilding it was a matter of carefully exposing those coals and adding fuel, a process that took minutes rather than the 15+ minutes of flint and steel. Done incorrectly, ash too thin, coals too exposed, and the fire burned through its fuel in the night and died. Done with too much ash coals fully smothered, and they died too, starved of oxygen. The margin was real and narrow, and Sarah hit it correctly almost every night, through years of practice, through the accumulated knowledge of her mother and her mother's mother, through the kind of embodied expertise that gets called just knowing how, because nobody thought to write it down. But here's the kicker. Banking the fire was not the last thing she did before the light was completely gone. There was one more task, and in some ways, it was the most interesting of all. A task that wasn't about protection or survival in the immediate sense, but about preparation, about the hours yet to come. She checked her work supplies. Specifically, she made sure everything she would need for the evening's work, the spinning, the mending, the tasks she'd be executing by candlelight for the next several hours, was positioned, organized, and ready to use before she lost the ability to see clearly. Thread needed to be where she could find it without knocking over the candle reaching for it. The spindle needed to be positioned correctly. Any mending that needed to be done required locating the specific garment and assessing the damage in natural light, because by candlelight, the assessment was much harder. This is, I realize, a small detail, but it keeps catching me every time I think about it, because it reveals something profound about the quality of attention Sarah brought to her own life. She was not just reacting to circumstances, she was anticipating them, managing them in advance, using the last of the daylight not just for daylight tasks, but to set up the conditions for her nighttime work to go smoothly. That is not just competence, that is a form of intelligence, and a kind of strategic thinking that our culture has historically called housekeeping, and treated as something anyone could do, something that required no particular cognitive gift, something invisible. It was none of those things. The last light fades, the grey goes dark. Sarah steps inside and pulls the door closed behind her, and the sound of the bar dropping into its bracket is the sound of the day officially ending and the night officially beginning. She has already been working for 12 hours. She will work for 5 more, but wait now that she's inside. Now that the animals are penned and the fire is banked and the wood is stacked and the water is hauled and the candle is lit, there's one more thing that needs to happen before the real nighttime work begins. Something that is so ordinary, so universally human, that it barely gets a sentence in most history books. The family needs to eat, and what Sarah puts on that table tonight, and how she puts it there, is one of the most quietly radical acts of domestic economy you've ever heard described. I want you to think about dinner. Not a special dinner, not a holiday meal or a birthday celebration or a night when you actually had time to cook something you were proud of. Just an ordinary Tuesday dinner, whatever you had last Tuesday, or whatever you'll have this Tuesday, the unremarkable, functional. This is just what we eat dinner that exists in every household as the baseline of daily nourishment. Now I want you to think about how much choice went into that meal, even if it felt like there was no choice, even if it felt like you just grabbed whatever was in the fridge or ordered the same thing you always order. There were dozens of micro decisions embedded in it. What cuisine, what protein, what vegetables, and whether they were fresh or frozen or from a can, whether to cook or not cook, how much to make, what to do with the leftovers. Sarah had almost none of those choices. And what she did with almost none of those choices is one of the most quietly brilliant things I've ever encountered in the history of everyday life. Let's talk about supper. The first thing to understand, and this reframes everything else, is that dinner in 1743 did not mean the evening meal. Dinner was the midday meal, the main meal, the one that required the most preparation, consumed the most fuel, took the most time, and delivered the most calories for the hardest working hours of the day. It was eaten around noon, sometimes closer to 1 o'clock, by people who had already been working for 6 or 7 hours and needed substantial fuel to get through the afternoon. The evening meal was called supper, and supper, in a colonial farming household, operated according to an entirely different philosophy. Sandra Oliver, a culinary historian who has spent decades reconstructing the actual food practices of colonial New England, not the idealized version, not the harvest table with the pilgrim hat version, but what people actually cooked and ate on ordinary days with ordinary resources, has documented what she describes as the remarkable continuity of colonial evening eating habits. Supper was not a fresh meal. It was not a separate culinary event. It was, in almost every case, a continuation and reconfiguration of what had been started that morning. Because in a household with one fire, one large cooking pot, and a woman who had approximately 47 other things competing for her attention, you did not cook twice in a day, if you could possibly help it. You cooked once, and you made it last. Picture this. Hanging over the fire in Sarah's keeping room, on an iron hook that allows it to swing in and out of the flame, is a large iron pot. It has been there since this morning. Inside, it is something that defies the word recipe. In the way we use that word, it is more of a philosophy, made edible. Dried peas, soft now after hours of simmering. Salt pork, the kind that has been preserved in brine since last winter's pig was slaughtered, giving off its salt into the liquid around it, seasoning the whole pot without requiring anything additional. Root vegetables, turnips perhaps, or parsnips, whatever was harvested from the kitchen garden before the first hard frost added hours ago, and now collapsed into the broth, thickening it. The whole thing has been sitting over the fire all day, visited occasionally, stirred when Sarah passed by with her hands free, never fully attended to but never entirely neglected either. This is not a recipe. This is a system. The pottage, which is what this type of dish was called, from a tradition that stretched back centuries through English domestic cooking, was the ultimate expression of what food historians now recognize as one-pot economy. One vessel, one fire. One sustained investment of fuel and heat that did multiple jobs simultaneously. It cooked the food. It kept the food safe from spoilage by keeping it hot. It provided warmth to the room through the steam it released, and it required minimal active labor once the initial assembly was done. You started it in the morning, you ate from it at noon, you ate from it again at supper, and if there was anything left, and Sarah made sure there was usually something left, you added water, added whatever scraps were available, and let it continue overnight on the banked fire, so that tomorrow morning, breakfast was already halfway made. This is the part that consistently stops me cold when I think about it. The temporal planning embedded in this cooking system is extraordinary. Sarah is not cooking for tonight. She is cooking for tomorrow morning at the same time. Every pot she makes is already thinking 2 meals ahead. Every scrap she saves, every bone she doesn't throw away, but puts back into the pot, every slightly wilted vegetable that might have seemed like waste, these are not frugality for its own sake. They are components in a forward-moving calculation that never fully resets. Nothing is wasted. Nothing can afford to be. Here's what will absolutely blow your mind about the economics of this. Historians who have done the caloric math on colonial farming diets have found that the average colonial family operated on what we would today recognize as a very narrow caloric margin. They were not starving a successful farming family like Sarah's had enough to eat, and the salt pork and dried peas that made up the core of their winter diet were calorically dense, nutritionally adequate if not exciting. But there was almost no surplus. Food that was wasted was not food that could be replaced by a trip to the grocery store. It was food that was simply gone, subtracted from a finite and carefully managed supply that had to last until the next harvest. This is why the pottage pot is not just a cooking vessel. It is an anxiety management system. As long as the pot has something in it, there is food. The pot being empty was not a neutral state, it was a failure state. And keeping it from reaching that state was Sarah's responsibility, maintained through a continuous low-level calculation of what was in it, what was available to add to it, how many people needed to eat from it, and how many days remained until the next resupply. The experience of eating supper in this household is also worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is so different from anything most of us have experienced that it almost requires a conscious, imaginative effort. There is no dining table in the modern sense, or if there is a table, it is a simple board on trestles, functional rather than decorative. There are no individual plates for each person, not in the way we mean. Trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread or wooden boards serve as individual eating surfaces for some family members, but it's just as common for the family to eat from a shared central bowl, each person with their own spoon dipping in. The idea of food being plated individually and presented to each person as their own portion is, for this household, either an aspiration or an irrelevance. There is no ceremony to it. Supper is not an event. It is a refueling stop. The children eat quickly because they are hungry and tired. Sarah eats standing up or perched on the edge of a stool or not really eating at all in any sustained way, nibbling, tasting, checking that everyone else has enough before she addresses her own hunger. This is so consistent across period accounts and diaries from this era that it almost reads as a law of domestic physics. The woman who cooked the food was the last one to eat it, and ate it with the least attention and the most interruption. Here's the kicker, and it is both practical and quietly devastating. In many documented cases, the woman of the household ate what was left after everyone else was served, not because this was explicitly ordered or because she was formally denied food, but because the system of serving everyone else first, children especially first, husband first, meant that by the time she sat down, the best of it was gone. She ate the parts that were less desirable, the pieces that were harder to chew, the portion of the stew that was more liquid than solid, because the denser parts had been served out first, and she did this without complaint, without recording it as an injustice, because it was simply the way things were, the texture of her life, unremarkable enough that it didn't require noting. What I find remarkable, and I want to be precise about this, because remarkable is not the same as romantic, is the genuine intelligence embedded in this entire food system. The one-pot method was not a sign of poverty of imagination. It was a sign of extraordinary practical intelligence operating under severe constraints. The women who developed and refined this approach over generations were solving an engineering problem. How do you provide adequate nutrition to a working family using minimal fuel, minimal equipment, minimal time, and ingredients that are mostly preserved, dried, or root stored? How do you do it every day? In winter, when fresh food doesn't exist? In summer, when the heat of a fire makes indoor cooking genuinely punishing? The pottage pot was their answer, and it worked. It worked so well that variations of this approach, the slow cooker, the one-pot meal, the cook once, eat 3 times, meal prep philosophy that fills modern food blogs are still being rediscovered and celebrated today, stripped of the survival necessity that originally generated them and repackaged as lifestyle choices for busy professionals. There is something both funny and melancholy about that. Supper ends not with a clearing away ritual, but with a simple reorganization. The remains of the pot are assessed. If there's enough to carry forward, it stays over the banked fire. If it's largely consumed, Sarah makes a calculation about what's available for morning and begins a preliminary assembly, dried grains measured out, water levels checked while she still has some energy left, before the evening's main work begins in earnest. The wooden spoons are wiped, not washed water is too precious to use on casual cleaning, and soap, handmade from ash lye and rendered fat, is similarly rationed. The eating surfaces are cleared. The children are repositioned closer to the fire. The candle is moved to where it will do the most good, and Sarah sits down, not to rest. There is no resting. She sits down to work. Because across the room from her, in the corner where the light from both the fire and the candle can reach it, is the instrument that will occupy the next several hours of her life. The instrument that clothed her family, that kept them warm, that, during the most extraordinary decade of the century, helped clothe an army. A spinning wheel. And the story of what happened at that spinning wheel, what it cost her, what it meant, what it built, is one of the most important and most overlooked chapters in American history. Let me tell you something about spinning that nobody tells you. It is loud. Not loud in the way that power tools are loud, not loud in a way that would disturb the neighbours or wake the children, but there is a sound to a spinning wheel in operation that fills a room in a particular way. A rhythmic low whirring from the wheel itself as it turns, the hiss of fibre being drawn out between the fingers, the occasional creak of the footrest, or the frames settling under repeated use. And underneath all of it, a kind of pulse, the steady, metronomic rhythm of a process that has its own tempo, its own internal logic, that once you fall into it carries you forward almost automatically. This sound was the sound of Sarah's evenings, every evening, for her entire adult life. And here is the number that I want you to hold in your mind as we talk about this, because it is the number that makes everything else real. 800 hours per year. That is the estimated annual labour requirement for spinning and weaving sufficient cloth to meet a colonial farming family's basic textile needs. 800 hours. Clothing for the family, bedding, household linens, the towels and tablecloths and curtain fabric, and the rough utilitarian cloth used for work, clothes and undergarments, and the bags that stored dried food, and the rags that served as bandages and cleaning. Cloths. All of it had to come from somewhere. In a city, you might buy some of it. In rural Massachusetts in 1743, for a family like Sarah's, you made it. From raw fibre to finished cloth, every step by hand. 800 hours divided across a year is a little over 2 hours per day, every single day, with no days off. Think about what you do for 2 hours every day without exception. Exercise, maybe, if you're deeply committed. A commute. Watching television in the evening. Now imagine that instead of any of those things, those 2 hours were occupied by skilled physical labour that had to be executed correctly or the output was unusable. That the results of those 2 hours were not entertainment or health, or the mild satisfaction of having gotten somewhere but the literal clothing on your children's backs. That is what the spinning wheel meant. Picture this. Sarah is seated now, the supper things cleared away, the children arranged in the keeping room in the various postures of the not quite ready for bed one of the older girls nearby with her own smaller spindle, working on a simpler task, learning by proximity and repetition the way children in this era learned almost everything. The candle is positioned to Sarah's left, throwing its 12 lumens across her hands and the fibre she's working with. The fire gives additional light, orange and variable, from the hearth. It is not enough light by any modern standard. It is what there is. The fibre tonight is wool. The sheep were shorn in spring, the fleece washed and dried and stored, and since then it has gone through a process of preparation carding, which means dragging the raw fibre through paddles studded with metal teeth to align the fibres and remove debris that produce the soft, airy rolls of prepared wool called rolags. The rolags sit in a basket beside Sarah's foot. She picks one up, attaches it to the leader thread on the spindle, and begins. The wheel turns. The fibre drafts out. This is the word for the process of drawing the fibres out to the right thickness before they're twisted into yarn. A process that requires constant tactile judgment, a continuous reading of the fibre through the fingertips. Too thick and the yarn is uneven, weak in places, prone to breaking when it's woven or knitted. Too thin, and it breaks during spinning, which means stopping, rejoining the thread, losing the rhythm. The right thickness is somewhere specific, and the only way to know where that is to have done it thousands of times before. Sarah has done it thousands of times before. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, whose decades of research into colonial New England women's lives produced insights that fundamentally changed how historians think about this period, has written with extraordinary precision about the textile labour of women like Sarah. What Ulrich found, combing through account books and diaries and estate inventories, was that textile production was not a supplementary activity or a leisure craft. It was the second largest economic activity in colonial New England, after agricultural production, and it was performed almost entirely by women, in the evenings, after everything else was done, by firelight and candlelight, in the hours between supper and sleep. Second largest economic activity in the region, performed by women, at night, after their actual workday was over. And here's what keeps me awake at night about this particular fact. It wasn't counted. Not in any formal economic sense. Not in the way that a merchant's transactions were counted, or a craftsman's output was counted. The cloth that Sarah produced existed in household accounts, sometimes a notation of how many yards of linen were woven, how many skeins of yarn were spun, but these notations were domestic records, not economic ones. They didn't feed into any understanding of regional productivity. They didn't contribute to anyone's picture of what the colonial economy actually ran on. The economy ran, in significant part, on Sarah's spinning wheel, and no one was counting. Now here's where this story goes somewhere completely unexpected. It's 1769. Sarah is older now. This is a different woman, or perhaps Sarah herself. 26 years further into her life, and something has changed in the political atmosphere of Massachusetts that is about to make her spinning wheel into a political act. The British Parliament has passed a series of taxation measures, the Townshend Acts, that include taxes on imported goods, including British cloth. And the colonial response, organised by groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, is a boycott of British goods. No imported cloth, no British textiles, but people still need to wear clothes. The solution proposed, organised, and executed almost entirely by women was what historians now call the spinning bees. Groups of women, sometimes dozens at a time, gathering in a home or a church meeting hall with their spinning wheels, spinning collectively, publicly, visibly, for hours. Producing the domestic cloth that would replace the British imports the colonists were refusing to buy, turning their ordinary domestic labour into a public political statement. Carol Birkin, a historian at the City University of New York whose work on women in the Revolutionary era is essential reading, has documented how newspapers, the primary media of the day, covered these spinning bees with genuine enthusiasm. Women who had been spinning invisibly, alone, in their homes every evening for their entire lives, were suddenly spinning in public, surrounded by neighbours, with reporters present. And what the reporters noted, with what reads now as almost comic surprise, was how good they were at it, how fast, how skilled. The output of a single spinning bee, a group of women spinning together for a day, was described in period accounts with something approaching awe. But here's the kicker. They had always been that fast. They had always been that skilled. The skill didn't materialise for the spinning bees it had been developing, every evening, in every farmhouse, for decades. What the spinning bees did was make visible what had always been invisible. They moved the spinning wheel from the private domestic space where it was taken for granted into the public political space where it could be recognised. And recognised it was. George Washington, in his correspondence from this period, acknowledged the critical role of domestic textile production in supporting the Continental Army's need for clothing and blankets. The uniforms that soldiers wore or the blankets they slept under, or the bandages that dressed their wounds passed through the hands of women like Sarah at some point in their production. The Revolutionary War was supplied in part by women sitting at spinning wheels in the evenings, after their families were fed and the fire was banked, working by candlelight for 2 or 3 hours before they allowed themselves to sleep. They did this not because they were asked to, they did it because it was Tuesday, because it was what you did on Tuesday and Wednesday and every night of the week, and had always done and would always do. The political dimension was new, the labour was not. Now I want to talk about what happened in that room beyond the spinning itself, because 800 hours a year of shared labour shared across mother and daughters, shared in the rhythms of the household evening, was not only economically productive, it was something else. Something that is harder to quantify but equally important. It was how knowledge moved. In a world with limited formal education for girls, the evening spinning session was a primary site of transmission. Sarah's oldest daughter, sitting nearby with her smaller spindle, was not just learning to spin. She was absorbing everything, the rhythm of the work, the way her mother assessed the fibre, the subtle corrections her mother made without stopping or commenting when the yarn began to go wrong. She was learning the banking of the fire and the management of the candle, and the calculation of supplies, and the quiet, ongoing threat assessment that her mother ran continuously throughout the evening. She was learning what it meant to be the woman of a household, what it required, what it cost, and she was learning it without it being called teaching, without it being called curriculum. It was called sitting with her mother in the evening, and it was the primary education she would receive for the role her entire life was structured around. There were stories told in these evening hours. History, family memory, practical knowledge, which plants were medicinal, which berries were poisonous, which neighbours could be trusted, which couldn't. Songs, sometimes not performance, but the low, absent-minded humming that keeps rhythm when the mind needs something to hold on to during repetitive work. Prayers. Gossip. The news that travelled by word of mouth from household to household, since newspapers were expensive and not universally accessible. The spinning wheel was, in this sense, the social infrastructure of the household evening. Everything organised itself around it. The children positioned themselves near it. The conversation flowed around its rhythm. The emotional texture of the family's evening was set by what happened in its vicinity. And then, somewhere between 9 and 10 o'clock, when the children's eyes were dropping and the younger ones had already been carried to their sleeping places and the fire had been adjusted and the candle was burning lower, something shifted. The official evening was ending, the household was quieting. And in that quieting, in that gradual surrender of the family to sleep, there was a moment brief, fragile, not guaranteed, that was something Sarah could not quite bring herself to name, even in her own mind. It was almost hers. But before I tell you what she did with it, before we get to the part of Sarah's night that is the most private, the most human, and in some ways the most heartbreaking, there is still work to be done. Because even now, even as the household sleeps, Sarah is already thinking about tomorrow, about what needs to happen before this night is over to make tomorrow possible. The thread never really ends. It just changes what it's attached to. There is a particular kind of quiet that descends on a house when the children have finally gone to sleep. If you have children, you know this quiet. If you don't, you felt something like it the moment when the last demanding thing in your environment finally stops demanding, and the air in the room changes quality, gets softer, somehow. Less pressurized. The silence after noise is a different silence than silence that was always there. It has texture, it has relief in it. Sarah knows this quiet well. She has been waiting for it, in a low-level way, since supper. Not because it means rest she knows better than to expect rest, but because it means the last hour or so of her evening can be conducted without interruption. Without a child needing something, without a question that requires her attention, without the ongoing ambient management of small human beings who cannot yet manage themselves. This is not her time. Not yet. That comes later, if it comes at all. First, there is work to be done for tomorrow, and here is something that I think about often. Something that I find genuinely beautiful in a way that is inseparable from how exhausting it is. Sarah's care for her family did not operate in the present tense. It operated in the future tense. Almost everything she did in these final hours of the evening was not for tonight. It was for tomorrow morning. For the people who would wake up in this house before dawn and need the world to already be partially organized on their behalf. 5 minutes of preparation tonight, 20 minutes saved tomorrow morning. That calculation never written down, never formalized, just lived and understood was the governing logic of her final working hours. And once you start seeing it, you see it everywhere in the historical record of domestic women's labor. The forward-thinking embedded in their work is extraordinary. Not dramatic, not celebrated, not even particularly visible, just constant, relentless, aimed perpetually at a future that was always arriving and always needing more than you'd prepared for. Let's walk through what she actually does. The grain comes first. Tomorrow's breakfast almost certainly a porridge of some kind, cornmeal or oats depending on the season, and the supply requires a specific amount of grain measured and ready before the morning cooking begins. Measuring it tonight, in the relative calm of the late evening, means not measuring it. Tomorrow morning when the fire needs tending, and the children are awake, and the cow needs milking, and every task is competing simultaneously for her hands and her attention. She opens the grain bin and assesses the level by touch and sound as much as by sight. The candle doesn't throw enough light into the corner where the bin sits to read the level accurately, so she reaches in, feels the depth, makes the judgment. How much is there? How many days does it represent? Is this a morning to be careful with the portion, or is supply comfortable enough to be generous? The calculation is instantaneous and habitual, but it is a real calculation, running against a real number that has real consequences if she gets it wrong. The measured grain goes into the iron pot with water. This is important. The grain needs to soak overnight. Soaking reduces the cooking time in the morning. Dramatically dried grains that might require an hour of steady fire to cook properly need only 20 or 30 minutes if they've been soaking since the night before. In a household where morning fuel is rationed and morning time is already overcommitted, 20 saved minutes and a smaller fire to achieve them is not a minor convenience. It is a meaningful difference. Then the bread. If Sarah is in a bread baking week, and bread baking happened on a rough cycle of every few days, producing enough loaves to carry the family through until the next baking, tonight is the night to start the dough, not to bake it, to start it. Bread in the 18th century, before commercial yeast existed, relied on wild yeast fermentation. A piece of dough saved from the last batch, the starter, was mixed with fresh flour and water and left in a warm place overnight to ferment, to rise, to develop the bubbles of carbon dioxide that would make the finished bread light rather than dense. This process takes time. It cannot be rushed. And it cannot be started in the morning and finished that same afternoon. The biology of fermentation operates on its own schedule, indifferent to yours. So Sarah mixes the dough tonight. She works it briefly just enough to incorporate the ingredients, not the full kneading that will come tomorrow, and sets it near the fire, where the banked coals will maintain just enough warmth to keep the fermentation active through the night. By morning, the dough will have doubled. By midday, after the final kneading and shaping and a second rise, it will be ready for the bake oven. But she won't be there to see it in the morning without having started it tonight. Here's what I find absolutely fascinating about this particular task. Bread making in a colonial household was a multi-day operation that required Sarah to be thinking, at any given moment, about where she was in the cycle and what the next step required. It wasn't a recipe she followed, it was a process she managed, continuously, in the background of everything else she was doing. The dough was always at some stage, something always needed to happen to it next, and knowing what that next thing was, and when, was simply part of the ongoing cognitive load of running this household. The water comes next. We talked about the water earlier, the hauling, the buckets, the well, or the stream outside. But evening water preparation was slightly different from the water she hauled at dusk. This was the final check. Were the household water supplies adequate for the morning's needs? Washing faces, making the porridge. Possibly starting the laundry if tomorrow was a laundry day, which required heating enormous quantities of water and maintaining a fire intense enough to boil it, was one of the most physically demanding days in the household calendar, a prospect that cast its logistical shadow backward across the days preceding it. If tomorrow was laundry day, tonight's water preparation was significantly more involved. The large cauldron needed to be filled, positioned, and set to begin heating overnight on the banked fire. Starting the heating process now, even slowly, meant the water would be meaningfully warmer by morning than it would have been if she'd started from cold. If tomorrow was not laundry day, the check was simpler. A confirmation that the household water vessels were full enough to see the family through to a morning trip to the well. Either way, she checks. She always checks. Now the clothing. Tomorrow's clothing for the children needed to be identified, located, and if necessary, repaired tonight. Not because there was a cultural expectation of immaculate dress there wasn't, not for working children in a farming household, but because a garment with a significant tear or a missing fastening was a practical problem that slowed down the morning getting ready process, and the morning getting ready process already had too much in it. Sarah moves through the house carefully, quietly, the candle shielded with her hand so it doesn't throw light onto sleeping faces, checking the small pile of each child's clothing. She is looking for obvious damage, for the kind of thing that can be quickly fixed with a few stitches tonight rather than discovered tomorrow morning as an emergency. If she finds something, she fixes it now. Standing up, probably, by the candle, a few quick stitches with the needle she keeps threaded and ready, because threading a needle by candlelight is an operation that takes longer than it should, and longer than she wants to spend on it. This is the kind of thing that looks, from the outside, like a very small act, a few stitches in a child's shirt. But embedded in those few stitches is something larger, a mother's continuous forward-scanning attention, the part of her cognitive life that was always partly located in tomorrow, always assessing the gap between what the morning would require and what was currently in place to meet it. She was always living slightly in the future. All of them were. Sandra Oliver, whose research into colonial domestic practice is meticulous and deeply humane, has noted that what we now call mental load, the cognitive labour of tracking, planning, anticipating, and managing the needs of a household was not a modern discovery. It was a constant of women's domestic experience throughout history. The difference is that in Sarah's time, the mental load was accompanied by the physical load, and neither was optional. Today, a woman might be exhausted by the planning even when the execution is shared or outsourced. Sarah planned and executed everything, simultaneously, without the option of outsourcing any of it, in the hours after a 12-hour physical workday. There is something that doesn't quite have a name not in English, and not in the language Sarah would have used either for the specific kind of fatigue that comes from this kind of work. Not physical fatigue exactly, though her body is deeply tired. Not mental fatigue in the way we mean when we talk about burnout. Something more like the fatigue of perpetual readiness. Of never being entirely off. Of having no moment in the entire day when nothing is required of you. When your attention is genuinely free. When the to-do list is actually finished. The to-do list is never finished. There is no such thing, in Sarah's life, as finished. But here's the kicker, and this is the thing that I think is most important to understand about this particular hour of Sarah's evening. This hour of setting tomorrow, it was not experienced as suffering. Not usually. Not in any direct, conscious way. The accounts we have from women of this era, the diaries and letters that survived, describe this work with something closer to matter-of-factness than complaint. This is what it was to run a household. This is what was required. The alternative, a poorly prepared morning, children going cold or unfed, dough that didn't rise, a garment that couldn't be worn was worse than the effort of preventing it. The effort was, In a very real sense, the love. The preparation was the care, made tangible. What I find remarkable is that this forward preparation ethic, this instinct to spend now to save later, to front-load the effort so that the morning could run smoothly, is one of the most sophisticated expressions of practical intelligence in the historical record. It required an accurate mental model of the future. It required the discipline to invest energy in preventing problems that hadn't happened yet, when that energy was running very low. It required, above all, the willingness to spend your last available reserves not on yourself, but on the people who would need things from you tomorrow. This is not a small thing. It was never a small thing. But here's what I want you to hold on to as we move forward, as this evening inches toward its last hour. Sarah has been awake for 15 hours. She has done more physical and cognitive labor than most modern people do in 3 days. She has fed her family, tended the fire, managed the light, done 2 hours of skilled textile production, and spent the last hour preparing for tomorrow. And she has done all of this without a single moment that was purely hers. Not one. But the house is quiet now. The children are sleeping. The bread dough is rising. The grain is soaking. The morning is as ready as she can make it. And in a few minutes, if the baby doesn't wake, if the fire doesn't need adjusting, if nothing interrupts the particular fragile quiet of a house, fully asleep, she might have something that doesn't quite have a name either. Not rest, not leisure. Something smaller than both of those words. Something stolen, really. Something that might be the most important chapter of this entire story. I want to pause for a moment on that quiet we just left. The house is still. The bread is rising. Sarah is, for the first time all evening, not actively doing something for someone else. She is standing in the keeping room in the near dark, the fire banked low, the candle burned to its last quarter inch, and there is for just a moment nothing immediately required of her. Hold that image. Now I want you to imagine that tonight is not that night. Tonight is a different kind of night entirely. Tonight, 3 days ago, word came through a neighbour that Reverend Hawkins and his wife would be calling, that the Prestons from the farm 2 miles east were coming for the evening, that there would be guests. And if you want to understand what guests are coming meant to a woman like Sarah, what it actually cost, what it required, what it demanded, you need to understand something fundamental about hospitality in colonial New England. It was not optional. Hospitality in 1743 was not a personality trait. It was not something you did when you felt like it, when the house was clean enough, when you had the energy. It was a social and moral obligation woven into the fabric of community life, so deeply that failing to perform it adequately had real consequences for your family's reputation, for your husband's standing in the community, for the network of mutual aid and reciprocity that was the only social safety net this community possessed. You did not say, "We're a bit tired this week, let's reschedule." You said, "Please come," and then you got to work. Picture this. It is 3 days before the visit. Sarah stands in the keeping room and looks at it with different eyes than usual. Not the eyes that see a functional space where her family lives and works and sleeps. The eyes that see what a visitor will see. And what those eyes find is not enough. Not quite enough. The floor needs to be swept more thoroughly than its usual daily sweep and then sprinkled with fresh sand, which helps with both cleanliness and the smell. The hearths around needs to be scrubbed. Ash and grease accumulate in ways that are invisible when you live with them daily, but obvious to fresh eyes. The one good tablecloth, stored folded in the chest, needs to be shaken out and inspected for the moth damage that is always a possibility with stored linens. The pewter needs to be polished. Not the everyday pewter, the company pewter, the pieces kept specifically for occasions like this, that lie wrapped in cloth in a separate place from the daily pieces and come out only when there are eyes to see them. And the food. This is where the weight of welcome becomes truly apparent, because the food for a company evening was not pottage. It was not the beautifully efficient one-pot system we talked about earlier, the calculated simplicity of the everyday. Company food was different. Company food was an investment of stored supplies that could not easily be replaced, of preparation time that had to be stolen from an already overcrowded schedule, of skill and effort that would be consumed in an evening and leave almost no trace behind. For a middling farming family like Sarah's, a proper company supper might include a roasted piece of meat, not the salt pork that appeared in the everyday pot, but a chicken or a piece of fresh beef, which required its own preparation and its own fire management. A pudding of some kind, sweet if sugar could be spared or dried fruit was available. Possibly a pie the construction of which required a pastry crust, which required the correct handling of cold fat and flour under hands that were practiced enough to know when the dough was right without being told. Tea, served in the good cups. If the family possessed good cups and had been careful enough with their tea supply to have some left for exactly this occasion, tea, in 1743 Massachusetts, was not inexpensive. And after the Townshend Acts and the growing boycott sentiment, serving British tea carried its own complex social signalling "do you serve it?", demonstrating that you have it and are not afraid to use it, or do you substitute something domestic and make a quiet political statement? These were not trivial calculations. They were the kinds of decisions that women made, quietly, in advance of company, and that shaped how the evening was read by the people who attended it. Here's what will absolutely blow your mind about the labour arithmetic of a single company evening. Richard Bushman, a historian at Columbia University whose landmark work on the culture of refinement in early America documented in meticulous detail how ordinary households performed social status through domestic objects and practices, estimated that the preparation for a significant social visit in a colonial household could represent upwards of 20 additional hours of labour spread across the 2 or 3 days preceding the visit on top of the household's regular workload. 20 hours for one evening, and every single one of those hours fell to Sarah. But here's the thing that makes this particularly interesting. The evening itself was not a rest from that labour. The evening was the performance. And performance, as anyone who has ever hosted anything knows, is its own category of exhausting. Picture this. The guests arrive. The Reverend and his wife, the Prestons, perhaps 1 or 2 others a neighbour, a cousin passing through enough people to make the keeping room feel full in a way it doesn't on ordinary evenings. The fire has been built up for the occasion, burning brighter and higher than its usual economy setting, making the room warm and the light more generous. The company candles are lit the better ones, the ones saved for exactly this. Maybe even a beeswax candle if the occasion merits it. The warm light it throws across the room noticeably different from the tallow glow of ordinary evenings. Sarah greets them. She is, in this moment, performing a role that has its own codified expectations. Warm but not overfamiliar. Gracious but not extravagant. Her dress is different, not elaborate. This is not a wealthy household, but it is her best, the one she keeps for Sundays and occasions. And she has done what she can with her hair, which is another 20 minutes she didn't quite have but found anyway. She takes their cloaks, she guides them to seats near the fire, she brings the tea, or the substitute, if she has made that choice in the good cups, on a tray that she carries with the particular careful steadiness of someone who is very aware that the cups on it are fragile and irreplaceable. And while she does all of this, while she moves through the room attending to the guests, refilling cups, retrieving the forgotten item from the kitchen, managing the food at the fire, she is also listening. Or rather, she is performing listening, which is different, nodding at the right moments, contributing brief, appropriate remarks when the conversation pauses in her direction, laughing at the Reverend's observations with exactly the right amount of warmth enough to be polite, not enough to seem forward. She is simultaneously a cook, a server, a hostess, an entertainer, and a social barometer. And she is doing all of this while calculating, in the background, whether the meat is done, whether the pudding has set, whether anyone's cup is getting close to empty, whether the fire needs to be adjusted, whether the children put to bed early and warned to stay there are going to stay there. Carol Birkin, whose work on women's social roles in early America is indispensable, has written about what she calls the invisible choreography of colonial women's hospitality, the way women manage social events through a continuous, effortless-looking series of interventions and adjustments that were, in reality, neither effortless nor invisible to the women performing them. The effortlessness was the performance. The invisibility was the point. A well-run evening was one in which the hostess's labour disappeared into the smoothness of the occasion, where no one noticed the management because the management was perfect. If anything went wrong, the pudding burned, a cup was broken, the conversation flagged, and no one stepped in to revive it. The failure was visible, in a way the success never was. Success was what was supposed to happen, only failure got noticed. Here's the kicker, and this is the part that I find both completely understandable and quietly heartbreaking. Sarah wanted this. Not the exhaustion, not the pressure, not the 20 hours of preparation, but the evening itself, the company, the voices in the room, the conversation that ranged beyond the immediate domestic concerns of the household, the news from elsewhere, the Reverend's observations about the political situation in Boston, the Preston wife's account of a relative in Connecticut, the simple, profound experience of being part of a social world larger than this house and this farm and these same few people day after day. The isolation of rural colonial life was real and significant. A farming family in 1743 Massachusetts could go days or weeks between meaningful contact with anyone outside their immediate household. The rhythms of farm labor, the distances between properties, the difficulty of travel in bad weather, all of these conspired to make the social world small and the same. Company evenings were a rupture in that sameness. They brought the world into the house. And Sarah, exhausted as she was, tired in a way that went down to her bones, needed that rupture. She needed to hear other voices. She needed to be part of something that was not purely about survival and production and the forward management of tomorrow's needs. She needed to be a person in a room full of other persons. The contradiction she lived inside, the desperate desire for company, and the equally desperate cost of providing it, was not lost on the women who wrote about their experiences in this era. Abigail Adams, whose letters provide one of the most vivid and honest accounts of colonial domestic life from a woman's perspective, wrote with remarkable frankness about the ambivalence of hospitality, the relief of company, the exhaustion of its requirements, the particular loneliness of being the one who made everyone else comfortable while your own comfort was the last item on the list. Adams was wealthier than Sarah, with more resources and more help, but the structure of the experience was the same. The guests stay for 2 hours, perhaps 3. There is food, consumed with appreciation that Sarah receives graciously and deflects. It's nothing, really, very simple, in the prescribed social performance of colonial modesty, regardless of what it actually cost. There are card games, perhaps, or music if anyone present plays an instrument. There is conversation, real conversation, the kind that leaves you feeling more connected to the world than you did before. And then they go. The Reverend and his wife take their cloaks from Sarah's hands and walk out into the dark, the Prestons behind them, and the sound of the door closing is a different sound from any other door closing of the evening. It is the sound of the performance ending, of the room returning to its ordinary self, of the borrowed brightness, the extra candles, the built-up fire, the best tablecloth becoming visible as exactly what it was, a temporary construction, an evening-long fiction of ease and abundance that now has to be disassembled by Sarah, alone, because her husband has retired, tired from the day's labour, as he should be, as everyone should be, and the children are asleep, and the neighbour who might have helped has gone home with the other guests, and what remains is a room that looks like a party just happened in it, and needs to look like a farmhouse again by morning. The cups need to be carefully washed and wrapped and returned to their storage place. The tablecloth needs to be checked for stains, a stain left overnight sets. A stain addressed now might come out. The remaining food needs to be dealt with. The extra candles, burned down but not entirely spent, need to be collected and stored. The fire needs to be taken back down to its banking configuration. And Sarah does all of this in the last hour of an evening that was already at the end of a day, that was already too long. She does it quietly, efficiently, without complaint, because complaining to whom? To the walls? To the banked fire? There is no one to hear it, and no point in saying it. But here's what I find extraordinary, what I want you to really hold on to, is that despite all of this, despite the 20 hours of preparation, and the performance of the evening, and the solitary clean-up after, the accounts we have suggest that Sarah would have said, if asked, that the evening was worth it, that she was glad they came. She meant it. She was glad, and she was exhausted, and both of those things were completely true, and she held them simultaneously with the ease of someone who had never been offered the option of only feeling one thing at a time. But the evening is over now. The room is restored. The house is quiet in a way it wasn't even an hour ago. And in this quiet, in this particular late-night quiet that follows the departure of guests and the completion of cleanup, something is available to Sarah that is available to her very rarely. A moment, small and fragile and entirely her own. And what she does with it, what she has always done with it, in the small hours of the night when the house finally sleeps, is the part of this story that undoes me every time. The candle is almost gone. She knows this without looking at it directly. She can tell by the quality of the light, the way it has shifted from its earlier steadiness into something slightly more tentative, a flame that is aware of its own diminishment, throwing shadows that move more than they did an hour ago. She has maybe 30 minutes left in it, maybe less. She should go to sleep. She knows this too. Knows it the way she knows everything practical about her own life, clearly, without illusion, with the full weight of evidence behind it. Tomorrow begins before dawn. The fire will need rebuilding. The porridge will need cooking. The children will need everything children always need, starting approximately 4 minutes after she opens her eyes. Every minute she stays awake now is a minute subtracted from the sleep that is the only thing standing between her and a tomorrow that is going to demand everything she has. She knows all of this. She stays awake anyway. And in this small, quiet act of staying awake past the point of sense, past the point of practicality, past the point where any reasonable accounting of her situation would tell her to put out the candle and lie down. In this is something that I think is one of the most profoundly human things in this entire story. She is stealing time, not from anyone in particular, not defiantly, not dramatically, just taking a few minutes that don't technically exist in the ledger of her day, that haven't been allocated to any task, that belong to no one's needs but her own, and spending them on something that is purely, entirely hers. Let's talk about what she does with them. For many women of Sarah's circumstance and era, the first choice was letters. Writing them, if they had someone to write to a sister in another town, a mother who had moved away, a friend from girlhood, now living a life that had diverged significantly from their own. Reading them, if any had recently arrived, saved for exactly this moment when there was quiet enough to read them properly, to give them the attention they deserved, rather than the hasty scanning she might have managed earlier in the day. The letters of colonial women are among the most extraordinary documents in American historical archives. Not because they are dramatic, most of them are not, or not in the way we usually mean dramatic, but because of what they reveal about the interior lives of women whose interior lives were otherwise almost entirely undocumented. In letters, the performance dropped. The colonial modesty, the careful social calibration, the relentless practical focus, all of it could relax, at least a little, in the space of a letter to someone who knew you. Abigail Adams, whose correspondence with her husband John and with her friend Mercy Otis Warren has been studied more than almost any other colonial woman's writing, is the most famous example of what a colonial woman's letters could contain. But Abigail Adams was exceptional in her education, her connections, her proximity to major historical events. What is striking is that even the letters of far more ordinary women farmwives, merchants' wives, women with limited formal education writing to sisters and cousins about entirely domestic concerns, have this quality of release in them, of saying things on paper that could not be said out loud, of recording, for someone who would understand, what the days actually felt like. Carol Birkin, at the City University of New York, has written beautifully about the function of women's correspondence in this era as what she calls a parallel social world, a network of connection and communication and mutual witnessing that existed alongside the official, documented, male-dominated social world and was in many ways more emotionally sustaining than it. Women kept each other company across distances through letters. They validated each other's experiences. They said, in the space of a letter, here is what my life is actually like, and received back, in return, yes, mine too. Picture this. Sarah has a small wooden box. It sits on the shelf above the spinning wheel, pushed to the back where it doesn't get in the way of the daily work, and it contains not much. A few letters, the most recent ones, the ones she hasn't yet replied to, a stub of pencil, a few sheets of paper, saved carefully because paper is not cheap and not infinite, and every sheet represents a choice. A small bottle of ink, for the occasions when she is writing something that warrants ink rather than pencil, which is to say, something she intends to keep, or send somewhere that will keep it. She takes the box down from the shelf now, in the near dark, and brings it to the table where the candle is burning its last. If she is writing a letter tonight, it is a specific letter, one she has been composing in her head, in fragments, for several days. A paragraph formed while her hands were carding wool. A sentence that came to her while she was hauling water, so complete and right, that she repeated it to herself several times to hold it in memory until she could get it onto paper. Colonial women's letters, when you read them carefully, have this quality of having been written in pieces assembled from the stolen moments of many days, finally transcribed in one sitting when the conditions allowed. She writes in the light of the failing candle, her handwriting small and economical because paper is limited and she has things to say. The letter is to her sister, who married a man from Connecticut 4 years ago and lives now in a world Sarah knows, only through these letters, a different town, a different house. Children who are Sarah's nieces and nephews and whom she has never met. The distance between them is not enormous by modern standards. By the standards of 1743, it is nearly absolute. The letter is not literary. It is not trying to be. It is news and inquiry, and the specific shorthand of two people who grew up in the same house and share a common language of reference that no one else entirely speaks. It says, "The children are well." It says, "We had a cold snap last week that took me by surprise." It says, in its own way, without saying it directly, "I miss you. I think about you. I am here, still, and I am glad you are there, and the distance between us is real, and I feel it." She signs it and folds it and sets it aside to be carried when next someone is making the journey in that direction, which might be weeks, which might be longer. And then, if there are minutes left, if the candle hasn't guttered yet, if the baby hasn't stirred, she might do something else. She might read. Reading, for a woman like Sarah in 1743, occupied a complicated social and moral position that is worth understanding because it explains why, even in this private stolen hour, there is sometimes a quality of furtiveness to it, of doing something not quite sanctioned. The primary approved text was the Bible. Regular Bible reading was not just permitted but expected. It was a religious and moral obligation, and a household that didn't engage with Scripture regularly was a household that was failing in its duties to God. Sarah read the Bible. She had passages memorized that she turned over in her mind the way you might turn over a smooth stone, not because she was consciously praying, but because the rhythm of the language was familiar and comforting in the way that very familiar things are, especially in the dark. But there were other texts. The Almanac, an annual publication that was, in this era, something like a combination of calendar, weather forecast, agricultural guide, and general interest magazine, was widely read and relatively affordable, and contained enough varied content to reward multiple readings across the year. Medical guides, recipe collections, the occasional moral instructional text, usually aimed specifically at women, instructing them in the proper management of households and emotions and relationships. And then increasingly, as the 18th century progressed, novels. This is where it gets interesting. The novel as a form was relatively new in 1743. Samuel Richardson's times, Pamela, often cited as one of the first true novels in the English language, had been published only 3 years earlier, in 1740, and was causing exactly the kind of moral panic that new popular entertainment forms reliably cause in their early years. Critics worried that novels, particularly novels read by women, were dangerous, that they filled women's heads with unrealistic expectations, that they encouraged emotional excess, that they distracted women from their proper duties. Which is to say, novels were exciting precisely because they were slightly transgressive. Reading one, for a woman like Sarah, had a quality of stepping slightly outside the prescribed boundaries of what she was supposed to want and think and feel. Here's what I find genuinely moving about this. Sarah's life was, by any external measure, almost entirely without novelty. The same house, the same tasks, the same people. The same sequence of days stretching backward and forward in time, with only the seasonal variation to mark 1 year from the next. Into this life of radical repetition, a novel introduced something that was almost physically shocking in its contrast. A story. Characters who were not her family. Events that had never happened and would never happen in rural Massachusetts. Feelings that were described in language more elaborate and more emotionally specific than anything the daily world offered. For 200 pages or 50 pages, or whatever she could manage in the scattered reading time available to her, she was somewhere else. Someone else. Almost. Following a story that had a shape, a forward momentum, a sense of meaning and consequence that daily life, with its endless repetition and its refusal to resolve into anything, didn't provide. She needed this, not as a luxury, as a form of psychological sustenance, Mary Fish, a Connecticut woman whose diary from the mid-18th century is one of the most intimate surviving accounts of a colonial woman's inner life, wrote repeatedly about the importance of private reading time, not as entertainment exactly, but as what she called refreshment of the spirit, a restoration of something that the demands of daily life continuously depleted. Fish was more educated than most women of her era, and her diary is unusually articulate about her own inner experience, but the need she describes is not unique to her. It appears, in less eloquent forms, in many of the fragmentary accounts that have survived. The need to be, for a few minutes, alone with your own mind, not managing anyone, not producing anything, not performing anything, just present, inside your own head, following your own thoughts wherever they went. This is what the stolen hour was for. But here's the kicker, and I want you to sit with this, because I think it's the most important thing in this chapter, even this small, private, technically unproductive hour, even the letter writing and the reading and the rare, quiet sitting with her own thoughts, even this was shadowed. Because Sarah knew without thinking about it consciously, but knew it in the way you know things that have never been said, but have always been true, that this time was not entirely sanctioned, that there were people, possibly including her husband, possibly including her own internalized sense of what she should be doing, who would have said, "Sleep is more important. The family needs you rested. This is indulgence." The guilt was part of the texture of these hours, not overwhelming, not paralyzing, but present. A low background awareness that she was spending something time, energy, candle on herself, and that spending things on herself was not entirely the point of her existence, as it had been defined for her by everything around her. She stole the time anyway, and I want to say something directly about this, because I think it matters. That theft was an act of self-preservation, not dramatic self-preservation, not the kind that gets written about or celebrated, the quiet, private, entirely invisible kind that consists of insisting, against the full weight of a life that has no space for it, on remaining a person with an inner life, on needing things that are not useful, on being, for 30 minutes in the small hours of the night, something other than what everyone else needed her to be. She blew out the candle, not because she was done, she is never done. Nothing is ever done, but because the candle was finished. The light it had been keeping was gone now, the wick a tiny ember that faded as she watched. The room went back to firelight only, the banked coals throwing a dim red glow that was just enough to navigate by. She sat for a moment longer in the dark. Then she got up, moved through the familiar room without needing to see it, and made her way to where she would sleep. Tomorrow would begin in a few hours. It would require everything she had, as it always did, as it always would. But tonight, for 30 minutes, in the light of a candle she had made with her own hands, she had been somewhere else. She had been, quietly and entirely, herself. And now we have to reckon with what all of this cost her. Not just tonight, not just this evening, but cumulatively, over years and decades, in a body that was never allowed to fully rest, and a spirit that was never given quite enough space to breathe, because the bill for a life lived like Sarah's always came due. I want to tell you about hands. Specifically, I want to tell you about what hands look like after 10 years of the life we've been describing tonight. After 10 years of hauling water and banking fires and rendering tallow and spinning wool and kneading bread dough and washing in cold water and wringing out wet cloth and gripping the handles of iron pots that are heavier than you'd, think, and doing all of this every day, starting before dawn, ending after dark, with no days off and no mechanism for recovery, Sarah is 26 years old. Her hands look like they belong to someone much older. The knuckles are enlarged, not dramatically, not in a way that would make a stranger stop and stare, but noticeably, permanently enlarged from years of repetitive gripping and the low-grade inflammation that comes from working with cold water and cold air without adequate protection. The skin is thickened on the palms and the fingertips, the kind of callousing that develops when soft tissue is repeatedly subjected to friction and pressure until it stops being soft. There are small scars from the kitchen knife, from the spinning wheel, from the countless minor injuries that happen when you work with fire and metal and sharp tools every day of your life, and there is no such thing as a sick day. When she stretches her fingers out fully, there is a resistance now that wasn't there at 16, a stiffness in the mornings that takes an hour of work to loosen. On cold days, and in Massachusetts, cold days run from October through April, which is more than half the year the stiffness is worse. significantly worse. Enough that the first hour of spinning in the morning produces a low, constant ache that she has stopped noticing consciously because it has been there so long that her baseline of normal has simply shifted to include it. She is 26 years old and she has the hands of a woman of 40. This is not a metaphor. This is not rhetorical. This is what historians of colonial women's health, a field that has only recently received the serious scholarly attention it deserves, have found when they look at the skeletal and documentary evidence of women's physical lives in this era. Catherine Sholton, a historian whose research into women's health and domestic labour in colonial America produced findings that fundamentally changed how medical historians think about this period, documented the pattern with meticulous precision. Women in 18th century agricultural households showed physical markers of aging that ran, on average, 10 to 15 years ahead of their chronological age. 10 to 15 years of wear, compressed into a body that had simply been asked to produce too much for too long without adequate rest or recovery. 10 to 15 years older than they were. Sarah is 26. Her body is somewhere between 36 and 41. But here's the thing, and this is the part that I find both the most devastating and the most important. To say clearly, the hands are just the beginning. The hands are the visible part, the part you could see if you look closely. The rest of the damage is less visible, distributed through a body that has been running at or near its physical limits since early adolescence. And it tells a story that the historical record has been extraordinarily slow to acknowledge. Let's start at the feet. A colonial farm wife in 1743 stood for the vast majority of her waking hours. Cooking required standing at the fire. There was no sitting while you stirred a pot or tended a roast, not with the hearth at floor level, and the pots hanging at heights that required you to be upright and mobile. Washing required standing at a basin or a trough. The kitchen garden required kneeling and bending, but mostly standing. Water hauling, firewood carrying, livestock management, all of it standing, all of it moving, all of it on feet that were, by the standards of what we now know about biomechanics and supportive footwear, very poorly protected. Colonial shoes, the shoes available to a farming woman of middling means, were simple leather constructions with minimal arch support, minimal cushioning, and soles that wore through faster than they could be replaced. By winter, when the ground was frozen and the barn floor was cold stone, standing on those feet in those shoes for 12 to 15 hours was an experience that accumulated in the ankles and the arches and the knees in ways that didn't announce themselves loudly, but never entirely went away. The spine tells its own story. The physical demands of colonial domestic labour were, by any biomechanical analysis, extraordinarily hard on the lower back. Lifting water buckets, iron pots, infants, firewood done repeatedly, in the bending and lifting pattern that centuries of ergonomic research have now identified as particularly damaging to the lumbar spine. Spinning, done for hours at a time in a seated position that required a specific forward lean and a continuous tension in the shoulders and upper back. Sleeping on surfaces that, by modern standards, provided minimal support rope beds with straw mattresses that compressed over time and were rarely replaced. The chronic back pain documented in women's diaries and letters from this era is striking not in its drama, but in its matter-of-factness. It appears as a passing mention, sandwiched between notes about the weather and observations about a neighbour's illness. My back has been troublesome this week. The familiar complaint in my lower back returned. I find the carrying harder than it was last year. Not complaints exactly, just facts. Recorded the way you record weather, as conditions to be noted and managed rather than problems to be solved, because they were not, in any practical sense, solvable. Here's what really keeps me awake at night about all of this. The chronic pain, the back, the hands, the feet, the shoulders, was not the worst of it. Physical pain, as anyone who lives with it knows, becomes part of the landscape of a life. You adjust. You compensate. You develop unconscious strategies for moving through the world in ways that minimize the worst of it. The body is remarkably adaptable, and the adaptation, while costly, is real. What was harder to adapt to was the fatigue. Not the normal fatigue of a hard day's work, the kind that a full night's sleep can address, that leaves you feeling restored and ready in the morning. That kind of fatigue Sarah had resources for. She understood it, knew how to move through it, had strategies for managing it. What she accumulated, over years, was something different. Something that what sleep she got, which was never enough, and never fully restoring, couldn't touch. The kind of fatigue that lives below the level of physical tiredness that is more correctly understood as a depletion of reserves, of the body's capacity to repair itself, to maintain its systems, to keep running at the level being demanded of it. Catherine Sholton's research documented what she described as a consistent pattern of what we would now recognize as chronic fatigue syndrome, presenting in women in their late 20s and 30s not diagnosed as such, because the diagnostic category didn't exist, but described in their own words with remarkable consistency across geography and circumstance. I am tired, in a way that sleep does not help. I wake more exhausted than I went to sleep. My body feels old to me in a way I cannot explain. I find tasks easy. Last year now beyond my strength, 28 years old, 31, feeling, in her own words, like an old woman. And here's the kicker here, is the thing that makes this not just sad but structurally important to understand. There was no mechanism for recovery. None. Not a weekend, not a vacation, not a period of reduced demand to allow the body to repair itself. The farm did not pause, the children did not pause, the fire did not pause. The demands of daily survival were identical on the day after a woman gave birth as they were on any other day. And childbirth itself, experienced without modern pain management, without reliable medical support, in conditions that we would today consider dangerous even for the healthiest women, was another enormous withdrawal from a physical account that was already running low. Most colonial women experienced multiple pregnancies. The physical toll of pregnancy, labour, nursing, and the postpartum period, stacked repeatedly through the 20s and 30s, with minimal recovery time between was, by any honest accounting, staggering. And yet it appears in the historical record almost as background noise, as something that happened, that was managed, that was moved through, because there was no alternative to moving through it. I want to talk for a moment about what this did to the spirit. Because the body and the spirit are not separate systems, and the toll that years of physical depletion took on the emotional and psychological lives of women like Sarah is documented, if you know where to look, with an honesty that is sometimes almost unbearable to read. Mary Fisher's diary, which we mentioned earlier, contains an entry written when she was 31 years old that I have thought about many times since I first encountered it. She does not use the words we would use today, she doesn't have them, but what she describes is a state that anyone who has experienced clinical depression will recognize immediately. A heaviness of spirit that she cannot account for, a difficulty finding motivation for tasks she knows she is capable of, a sense of distance from her own life, as though she is watching it from slightly outside herself, a conviction, persistent and resistant to reason, that she is failing at everything, that her efforts are insufficient, that the gap between what is required of her and what she is able to provide is widening and will not close. She is 31. She has been running at this pace for 15 years. What strikes me most about this entry is not its sadness, though it is sad. It's the complete absence of any expectation that her situation might change. She doesn't write about wanting things to be different. She writes about enduring, about finding ways to continue, about the small graces, a kind word from a neighbour, a letter from a friend, a morning when the light was particularly beautiful that make continuation possible. This is what the historical record of women's emotional lives in this era looks like, again and again. Not complaint, not the expectation of remedy, just the documentation of endurance and the small, persistent search for reasons to keep going. There is no retirement in Sarah's future. No moment when the demands will reduce themselves to a manageable level, when she will be able to rest in any sustained way. The work will continue until her body cannot perform it, and when that moment comes, it will be experienced not as an earned rest, but as a failure of function, a body that is no longer doing what it is supposed to do, becoming a burden rather than a resource. The women who appear in the documentary record as elderly in their 60s, in their 70s, which in 1743 represented a genuinely remarkable survival, are described with a consistency that is telling. Small, bent, hands that no longer open fully, moving slowly, carefully, with the particular economy of motion that people develop when movement is painful, still working, most of them, still doing what they can, which is less than they once could, which registers as diminishment rather than as the earned quietude of a life well spent. David Freeman Hawke, whose research into the everyday textures of colonial life painted perhaps the most complete picture we have of what it actually felt like to live in this world, wrote that the women of this era aged in the service of others, and that this aging was so universal, so expected, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of what womanhood meant in this culture, that it was invisible as a phenomenon. You couldn't see it because it was everywhere. You couldn't name it as a loss, because no one had ever suggested it could be otherwise. And yet, here is what I want to say before we leave Sarah's body, before we step back from this particular accounting of what her life cost her physically and psychologically. Here is what the historical record also shows, with equal consistency, alongside all the evidence of depletion and endurance and invisible damage. These women were not defeated. The diaries that record the back pain also record, in the same entry, the satisfaction of a well-executed piece of work. The letters that mention exhaustion also contain wit, observation, tenderness, humour. The women who described feeling old at 30 also described, without apparent contradiction, moments of genuine joy in their children, in their friendships, in the natural world around them, in the stolen hour, with a book by a failing candle. The human capacity for both things simultaneously, for suffering and for meaning, for depletion and for love, for exhaustion and for the stubborn, persistent insistence on finding something worth staying awake for, is on full display in the lives of women like Sarah. It doesn't redeem the suffering. It doesn't make the injustice of it less unjust, but it makes these women fully, completely human in a way that pure victimhood cannot. They were not just enduring, they were living, and that the full complexity of what it meant to live a life like Sarah's, the cost of it, and the richness of it, and the injustice of it, and the dignity of it, is what we carry with us now as we come to the final chapter of this story. Because we haven't finished yet. There is one more thing to do, one more conversation to have. Between Sarah's world and ours, between her night and yours, between what she carried and what, 300 years later, we are still, in ways that might surprise you, carrying too. Let's come back to tonight. Your tonight. The one you're in right now, wherever you are in the world, whatever city, whatever hour it is there, the bed you're lying in, or the couch you've settled into, or the chair you pulled close to whatever light you're using to wind down with at the end of your day. Think about what you did today. Not the extraordinary things, the meetings that mattered, the conversations that went somewhere interesting, the moments you'll remember. I mean, the ordinary things. The things that don't make it into any account of your day because they are too small, too repetitive, too obvious to mention. The meal you made, or assembled, or ordered, and then cleaned up after. The thing you noticed was running low and added to the list. The child's need you anticipated before it was expressed. The appointment you remembered to make. The emotional temperature of your household that you read and adjusted to, continuously, without being asked and without being thanked. Because that is simply what you do. The load that you carry that doesn't have a name on the spreadsheet. Now hold that feeling, that specific, particular, slightly exhausting feeling of being the person who tracks everything. And let me tell you something. It has a name now. 2 names, actually. The first is the second shift. It was named and described by the sociologist Arlie Hochschild at the University of California, Berkeley, whose landmark 1,989 study documented what she found when she followed dual-income couples home from their paid jobs and watched what happened next. What happened next, in the vast majority of households she observed, was that the women came home and started a second job. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, household management work that was just as real and just as demanding as the paid work they had just completed, but that existed in a different category. Unpaid, unacknowledged. Not counted in any economic measure of what a person contributes. Just expected. Just there. Idea. Hochschild calculated that the women in her study worked, on average, an extra month of 24-hour days per year compared to the men they lived with. An extra month, every year, of work that appeared in no record, produced no income, and received no formal recognition. She published this in 1989. The year is now 2026, and the Pew Research Center's most recent data on the distribution of unpaid household labor shows that the gap has narrowed, genuinely narrowed, which matters and should be acknowledged, but has not closed. Women still perform a disproportionate share of unpaid domestic labor in households across every income level, every educational level, every country where the data has been collected. The specific tasks have changed. The structure has not. The second name is mental load. The concept, the cognitive labor of tracking, planning, anticipating, organizing, and managing the invisible infrastructure of a household and a family was popularized in a 2017 comic by the French cartoonist Emma, which went so thoroughly viral that it briefly broke the internet, which tells you something important about how many people recognize themselves in it immediately and completely. What the mental load describes is exactly what we've been watching Sarah do all evening. Not just the physical tasks, the cooking, the spinning, the water hauling, but the continuous background processing that made those tasks possible. The knowing that the grain was running low before it ran out. The anticipating that tomorrow needed the bread to be started tonight. The tracking of the candle supply against the calendar. The emotional assessment of every person in the household and the quiet adjustments made in response. The planning that was always already happening, always ahead of the present moment, always in service of needs that had not yet announced themselves. This is what the mental load is. And the reason the 2017 comic broke the internet is that millions of women read it and felt, for the first time, that something they had been carrying invisibly for years had been seen, named, acknowledged as real work, rather than as the natural, effortless expression of feminine instinct that culture had always insisted it was. Here's what I find absolutely staggering about this. Sarah would have recognized every word of that comic. Not the vocabulary. She didn't have our vocabulary for it, but the experience. The specific, wearing, never quite finished quality of being the person who holds everything in their head so that everyone else doesn't have to. She lived that every day of her life. The tools have changed beyond recognition. The fire has become a thermostat. The spinning wheel has become Amazon. The tallow candle has become the light you're reading this by, produced by infrastructure so vast and reliable that you have never once thought about whether it would be there when you needed it. The distances that isolated Sarah have been collapsed by technology that would seem to her like pure magic. But the structure, the invisible, unacknowledged, uncounted labor of keeping a household and a family and a life running the structure has a lineage that runs in a direct, unbroken line from Sarah's keeping room in 1743 to your kitchen in 2026. And here is what I want to say about that lineage, as clearly and directly as I can. It is not inevitable. It is not natural. It is not the expression of some biological truth about what women are or what they are for. It is a historical construction built over centuries, maintained by custom and expectation, and the simple inertia of things being the way they have always been. And like all historical constructions, it can be examined, questioned, deliberately, consciously changed. The first step in changing something is seeing it. That is what tonight has been about, seeing it. Seeing Sarah at the spinning wheel at 9 o'clock at night when she has already been working for 14 hours. Seeing her in the kitchen before dawn, rebuilding a fire that she banked the night before so that the morning would be warmer for the children. Seeing her standing at the door, watching the sunset with an expression that has nothing romantic in it, just the focused attention of someone who is calculating, always calculating, what the next hour requires. Seeing her hands. A group of psychologists at the University of Michigan, studying what they call invisible labor in modern households, found something that I think is important enough to say plainly. The primary emotional consequence of performing invisible labor is not resentment, as might be expected. It is invisibility, the feeling of being present and essential, and yet somehow unseen, of mattering enormously to the functioning of everything around you while being taken entirely for granted by it. Sarah felt this. The diaries tell us, not in those words, she didn't have those words, but in the recurring, quiet note of someone who is doing everything and being seen doing almost nothing. Who is thanked for the extraordinary occasions and taken for granted in the ordinary ones, which is to say, taken for granted almost always, because ordinary is what almost always is. The seeing is the thing, the acknowledgement, the willingness to look at what has been invisible and say, I see this, I see what it costs, I see that it is not nothing, I see that the person doing it is not a machine, not a function, not a category, but a person, with a body that accumulates damage and a spirit that needs replenishment, and an inner life that deserves more than 30 stolen minutes by a failing candle before a day that begins again before dawn. I see you, Sarah. I see all of them. The millions of women whose names we don't have, whose evenings we can only reconstruct in fragments, whose hands did the work that built the world we live in, and whose labour was never counted in any ledger that history thought worth keeping. I see them in the modern woman who stays up an hour past the point of sense because it is the only hour that is hers. I see them in the person who notices the toilet paper is running low and adds it to the list, not because they were asked to, but because they are the person who notices. I see them in the mother who lies awake after everyone else is asleep, running the tomorrow calculations that will never make it into any record of what she contributed to this family's life. The thread is unbroken. It runs from Sarah's spinning wheel to right now, to this conversation, to you lying there in whatever city it is, whatever hour it is, with whatever version of this weight you are carrying. And here is what I believe, what tonight has made me believe more firmly than ever. The ordinary is not small. The daily repetition of care, the feeding, the tending, the preparing, the anticipating, the noticing, is not a lesser form of contribution to human life. It is not background noise to the real story. It is the real story. It is the story that made every other story possible. Every war that got fought, every book that got written, every discovery that got made, every civilization that got built underneath it, holding it up, making it possible was this. The fire that didn't go out, the children who were fed, the cloth that was woven, the morning that was ready. Sarah made the morning ready. Every morning, for her entire life, she made the morning ready for people who mostly didn't think about how the morning got that way. And she did it with hands that hurt and a back that ached, and a candle that was always almost gone, and a store of energy that was always being drawn down faster than it could be replenished. And she did it with love. That is the word I keep coming back to. The word that doesn't quite fit the scale of what I mean, but is the closest available. Not the romantic love of stories, not the dramatic love of grand gestures. The daily, practical, shown in action love of someone who gets up before dawn because the fire needs to be there when the children wake up. Who soaks the grain overnight, so breakfast is easier in the morning. Who sits up past the point of sense to finish the mending so her child doesn't go cold. That love was real. It was enormous. It was never adequately seen or named or thanked. We can see it now. And seeing it, really seeing it, in its full weight and complexity and cost is the beginning of something. Of a different kind of attention we might pay to the invisible labour happening around us right now, today, in the people we live with and love. Of a different accounting we might make of what constitutes a contribution to a shared life. Of a different story we might tell about what matters, what counts, what gets remembered. History remembers the names on the documents, the signatures on the declarations, the faces on the coins. History forgot Sarah, but Sarah was there. She was always there, keeping the fire, mending the cloth, watching the sky, stealing her 30 minutes, making the world run so smoothly that no one thought to ask who was doing the running. We know now. Keep an eye out for our next story, where we'll be exploring a chapter of history equally hidden, equally human, equally worth the candlelight. I can't tell you too much yet, but I think it will stay with you. Sweet dreams tonight, wherever you are, and may whoever is keeping the fire in your life know, without a shadow of doubt, that you see them.